Ons het die voorreg om vanmôre te gesels met Dr. Brin Hodgskiss en ook met Nicole Engelbrecht. Sy is via Teams by ons en Dr. Brin sit hier by ons. Ons gesels oor 'n boek wat omtrent vir jou koue rillings gee. Die boek is genaamd Rillerstories, getiteld Rillerstories, en dit gaan oor stories deur moordenaars en oor moordenaars. Good morning, Brin.
Good morning, Pierre, and good morning, Jennifer. Thanks so much for having me.
It's lovely having you here. And good morning, Nicole, on Teams, on the screen. Nice to have you as well.
Good morning, thank you so much.
Lekker. Nou kyk, as jy 'n fan is van 'n goeie moordstorie, dan is hierdie die boek vir jou. Brin, we have to talk about where this all started, the source of this book. Where's the genesis for the book?
So the genesis for the book was when I was working with the South African police, and they needed somebody to build up our knowledge of South African serial murderers. So I went round from maximum security prison to maximum security prison, speaking with some of the most well-known South African murderers. And then, you know, I did my PhD with that information I got working with Mickey Pistorius and Gerard Labuschagne, and then forgot about it, and all the recordings that I took of those interviews just sat gathering dust until one day Nicole found my thesis, read it online and said, actually, should we have a conversation first on her podcast? And then we thought, well, maybe we can do a book on this. So that's where it all started.
I have great respect for you because I will not be able to do this. I will have nightmares for like years if I had to do all the interviews. And I think it's brilliant that you guys have actually done this. Nicole, let me ask you, why do you think it was a good idea to write a book? Like when you found the thesis and read through it and the podcast, why did you decide, oh, wow, this would actually make a brilliant book?
I think after 5 years of focusing on true crime content in my career, when I read this thesis, it really struck me as a different way to approach understanding the minds of these offenders. And, you know, I think already at that point, I saw in it something that the public needed to see. And not just to understand offenders, but also, you know, as we speak about in the book, to understand their own stories, and certainly the stories of the victims of violent crime in South Africa as well.
Brin, the angle that this book takes is the explanation, psychological, well, not explanation, it's maybe just an illustration of the psychological state of the murderers, of the serial killers when they perpetrated these murders. That's an immense insight, and it takes a lot of understanding and a lot of sensitivity going through that.
Oh, thank you very much. But one of the things that did come out when I was, you know, speaking to the men in the book was that the story they told about themselves often then helped create the crime and help the crime continue. And often those stories were reflected in what they did. And that was what fascinated me, coming from the perspective of narrative psychology. And that was something Nicole and I just drew out in the book, because we realized actually there's parallels between the stories these men tell themselves and the stories that you or I tell ourselves.
Wow.
So that's what we wanted to bring to the readers.
That's a bit close to home. I mean, some people will tell you, how is that possible? I'm not like these killers. How can you, I can't relate to them.
Totally, and I know some people will like definitely get that feeling, but for me, what came across speaking with a lot of the killers was their humanity, that they are humans, just like we are. And my experience with my own story shows that actually, if you don't pay attention to the story you're telling yourself, that can lead you down a dark path, and that can tip you over into being somebody you didn't think you were.
Were there any misconceptions, when you spoke to these killers, were there any misconceptions about what they thought happened and what actually happened in reality? Or was it always kind of they knew exactly what it was that they did?
You know what was really fascinating for me is that often they definitely all understood right and wrong. But sometimes they would tell themselves a story, and I mentioned one guy in the book, Kyle. His story was so confused and mixed up. When I listened to him first time, I got a little bit frustrated. I was like, are you lying to me? But 20 years later, when I listened to it again, I thought, actually, That story, by being so confused, means Kyle never has to come to terms with what he did.
Ooh. Oh, wow.
You know, there's always a gap between the person he thinks he is and who he really is. And that contrasts really strongly, because we end the book on a bit of a more redemptive note. Sure. With somebody who really addressed his own story and took accountability for it. And that was the key to his redemption.
Nicole, was there any story in here that really surprised you? I mean, you've been working on real crime, and you've been this is your field of expertise. But was there one story in here that really caught your attention?
I think to a certain extent, all of them in a way really surprised me. And the reason was that I knew these crimes. You know, we keep them anonymous in the book, but I knew these crimes. I thought I knew what may have been going on in these men's heads when they committed these crimes. But I think what really surprised me about all of them was just how differently they saw themselves than firstly, how the media had portrayed them, and secondly, how the public in general had, developed this perception around. So I think for that reason, really, they all, all of the stories surprised me from that perspective.
Nicole, it is interesting that you talk about perceptions, because I think in general, as a public, when we hear someone's committed a crime, we immediately just make them out as villain. They're just pure evil. They're just bad. And I suppose you, having worked in this field and you've working in this field, Brin, you would have seen a different side of people too, that people perhaps aren't necessarily, and perhaps you can answer this, Nicole, aren't necessarily just pure evil and just bad.
Yeah, and I think that's been a journey for me as well, because I came into this with the perception, as most people, in the public have, that there's, the good and evil, and these men are simply just bad, or when women as well, of course, we have female offenders. And I think that has been a journey for me as well, is understanding that it's not all black and white. There are many shades of grey in between. Yes, these offenders need to take accountability for what they've done. And, certainly for the most part, except maybe for Kyle in the book, the men do understand they did commit these crimes and it was their fault. But I think what this book really helps us to do is just to understand that there's so much nuance. We can have empathy for the difficulties that these offenders experienced at times in their lives, which are so similar to what some of us may experience, while simultaneously not excusing the terrible acts they committed.
Brin, many years ago, your extensive thesis about all these cases, and then publishing them later on in this book form. There are certain things that you naturally would leave out, certain stories that you prefer to tell rather than others. Why choose these specific stories from your library of interviews? And why leave some out?
That's a great question, Pierre. For this book, what I wanted to focus on was offenders who had mainly killed on their own.
On their own?
Yes, so without an accomplice. So there was one of the stories where somebody had an accomplice, but for the main part, they were men who committed crimes on their own. Ah. By chance, some of the other men I spoke to had an accomplice, so I wanted to keep it much simpler. Yeah. But also, I was trying to pick those stories that helped illustrate the power of stories the most. So I would be picking the tapes when I went back. I was like, well, I do remember how vividly speaking to Michael or Jacques or Karel. So that then sort of led me to explore those interviews and leave some for another day.
Oh.
Why keep the killers anonymous?
Firstly, because it was psychological research. So my agreement when I interviewed the gentleman was, you know what, you will be kept anonymous for the purpose of the thesis and for any other subsequent use. Yeah. But the added benefit I found when I was writing the book was, because of what Nicole said, the media image of these men is quite different from the reality of the man sitting as close as I'm sitting to you, having a coffee. It's very different, and that's the person that I wanted to bring to the readers, because that's the human face, but it's also the reality of what a murderer really is like.
Nicole, Brin spoke about the nuances of these stories, and you also said there's many shades of grey. It's not just black and white. What do you want people to take away from this? If you think there's something that the reader can take away afterwards, the one thing that sticks, what would that be?
I think as someone who has created content in the true crime genre over the last 5 years, for me, I really like readers to take a...
Well, Brin, maybe you have some internet issues. Maybe you can answer that.
Yeah, no problem. Like, the thing that I would really like people to take away would be the power of listening to other people's stories, and that I really believe that if you listen to other people's stories, you can make the world a better place. And that includes also listening to your own story and the story you tell yourself about yourself.
Sure.
Because again, you can see from the book how badly wrong it can go if you get it wrong. So I'd like the readers to go away with a few more tools to get it right.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Nicole. Right at the end there, we got flummoxed by the internet, but I'm glad to see you back. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. Thank you for taking time, Brin. Thank you for all the work you've done. It is scary stuff. I'm struggling to get through it because I'm also a little bit scared. But thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you very much for having me. And us.
And us. Yes, it's an absolute pleasure. Nou ja, as jy hou van hierdie stories, as jy die konstitusie het om die ding deur te lees, ek en Jennifer sukkel. Brin Hodgskiss en Nicole Engelbrecht se Killer Stories. Wat 'n grillerige boek. Maar ja, elke ding het seker sy nuance in hom, né? Nee.